more red, white, and blue. How about green? And there's no way the working folk will ever be free, long as big business owns this country.
Hello, this is Colin. Welcome. Today's show, the entirety of this episode, will be devoted to the subject of third parties. Third parties maybe is the wrong term. In fact, it's hard to know the right term. Here in Connecticut, by legislative language, we call them minor parties, which seems oddly dismissive. So maybe we should call them parties that are not the two major parties. In any case, we'll be talking to people who are candidates from independent parties. We'll be talking to a professor of political science who studies these movements. But we're going to begin kind of with the big news in that world. We had Christine Todd Whitman on our centrism show, and now Andrew Yang, co-founder with her and David Jolly, and co-chair of the New Forward Party, previously ran as a Democratic candidate for president and for mayor of New York City. First of all, Andrew Yang, welcome to our show.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So the Forward Party kind of is the big news of this electoral season, at least in terms of third parties or independent parties. Maybe just begin for people who didn't read the manifesto in the Washington Post or don't have that much familiarity. Explain what this actually is.
Well, thank you. The Forward Party is a new popular movement for people who want our leaders to actually listen to us. Our core principles are free people, thriving communities, and a vibrant democracy. And you have to ask, why do we have none of those things? Why do people feel so constrained? Why are our communities surviving, not thriving? And why does our democracy always feel like it's hanging by a thread? The Forward Party aims to restore the connection between people and our government.
Now, it's tricky because you are not applying particular policy litmus tests. Is that correct? I mean, there isn't like a policy set to which a candidate needs to adhere or come close to. So how do you decide who's Forward Party material and who isn't?
Well, our core principles, we believe, speak for themselves in terms of the values that they reflect, but the policies revolve around the people themselves. And let me explain. Anyone who is part of the Forward Party has to be for something called ranked choice voting, as well as nonpartisan open primaries. The people of Connecticut might have heard of ranked choice voting as championed by the Griebel-Frank for Connecticut Party, which is now affiliated with the Forward Party. The goal is to align our leaders' incentives with what works for us. And right now, those incentives are supposed to exist but don't exist because within the two-party system, they have now carved up the country into turf or territories where one party typically rules or dominates. Connecticut is relatively purple and swingy, though I think most people might regard it as dominated by Democrats. And so in most of the country, there's not any legitimate contest of ideas and not any real accountability on the part of leaders and representatives to deliver for us. There's like a pretend line of accountability that most Americans now know is evaporating.
So I want to go back to the first thing you said there, which is, so in a sense, this is somewhat about people, maybe even a particular kind of, I don't know, personal disposition, a person who maybe is more consensus seeking, a person who isn't interested in polarization?
Yeah, some of our core values are around things like grace and tolerance, where we want leaders who are willing to compromise, who are not ideologues, who are results and solutions driven, which is what most people in Connecticut and what most Americans want. The fact is our politics are much more extreme than we are because our politicians are being distorted by incentives and media-driven back and forth and social media that are rewarding them for jumping up and down and making a lot of noise while the problems in our communities just get worse. More and more Americans are fed up. And we're being played against each other. We're being told, you know who the problem is? Those people over there who disagree with you. More and more Americans are waking up to the fact that that's not the problem. The real problem is that we have unaccountable, unrepresentative institutions that are failing us increasingly.
So you're not nominating Forward Party candidates, at least in this cycle, right? This is more about kind of cross endorsement.
Well, we're backing 27 to 30 candidates at every level, including independents, Republicans, and Democrats who are for some of these reform measures. There are candidates in Connecticut. I believe at the Senate level, it's Evan McMullin in Utah, Lisa Murkowski in Alaska, and Mark Kelly in Arizona. We are going to be achieving party recognition and ballot status in 15 states by the end of this year, 30 by the end of 23, and then all 50 thereafter. So you will see Forward Party appear on your ballot. People in Connecticut will see the Griebel-Frank for Connecticut party on your ballot in November, and that is a Forward Party affiliate. So in the meantime, though, we're not wasting time. We're endorsing everything from city council and county executive candidates all the way up to U.S. Senate.
Right. I want to clarify for anybody listening, the late Oz Griebel ran for governor on that line, that Griebel-Frank line. Monty Frank was his running mate. So that's why that line exists. So I want to make sure that I understood what you just said. So you do imagine, 2 years, 4 years, 6 years out, there will be specific freestanding Forward Party candidates?
Well, Connecticut is a fantastic example. And when you show up in November to vote, you'll see that there's a Griebel-Frank for Connecticut line, and Ned Lamont is the endorsed gubernatorial candidate. Now, Governor Lamont came out for ranked choice voting in order to earn that endorsement, which helps explain, frankly, why candidates are getting on board with ranked choice voting, because voters are pushing them toward it. So just as there's a line in Connecticut, there will be a line in other parts of the country. Generally, it'll be called the Forward Party, though in some cases, there's a predecessor like Griebel-Frank. And I believe that you might see in Connecticut that switch to Forward in the months to come.
Yeah, so, we should just to sketch out the Connecticut landscape. So what we have here in Connecticut is the so-called Independent Party. That is the name of it. It's a somewhat confusing name. A lot of people may be enrolling in it by mistake by thinking when they check independent on their ballot applications. But that typically has been a cross-endorsing party for Republicans. Working Families cross-endorses to the most progressive Democratic candidates. But I'm still trying to wrap my mind around what it looks like in 24 or 26. Is the Forward Party going to have nominating conventions? Are you going to, kind of follow the conventional route of a party structure?
We're going to have a national convention next summer, so you're going to see a lot of action and activity. We're backing a host of candidates, not just in this cycle, but in the local races in 2023. Believe it or not, there are local races in 2023. So there's going to be another convention in 2024 with candidates at both national and local levels.
And is it, in your imagination of this, I assume what we're also thinking about is that the Forward Party kind of magnetizes itself, once again, for a certain kind of candidate, the sort of more moderate, Rockefeller, Jacob Javits type Republican, the slightly more conservative to moderate, Casey type Democrat, right? Is that what you're looking for, is to ultimately wind up with a bunch of names attached to your cause who kind of represent something close to a center?
That's who the Forward Party is attracting initially, people who are fed up with both parties and tend to be a bit more what you'd call moderate or reasonable or consensus driven. And we hope to expand our tent to include people who right now are just on the outside of the political process looking in. Even when you are trying to define Forward, you're using a left to right spectrum, which is being used to falsely divide Americans. The fact is, I've spoken to thousands of people in every part of the country, and there's a lot more agreement than disagreement. It's just when we get cordoned off into these lanes or these boxes, the fact is it's not left versus right. It's those who are on the outside looking in, which unfortunately now resembles most Americans, or those who feel like our institutions aren't working. And people can feel that and be very conservative or very liberal.
I'm also assuming, because I'm talking to Andrew Yang right now, that you're also looking for candidates who introduce a lot of ideas and issues, or at least some ideas and issues, that aren't part of the mainstream discourse typically. They're not part of the rote default of understanding of what a political campaign is about. You as a candidate brought up issues about AI, about the increasing depletion of jobs as AI and related technologies come online. That's something typically presidential candidates have not brought up. I'm assuming you're looking for that, too, in the Forward Party, people who are going to introduce issues that aren't issues otherwise.
We're looking for people who want to solve the real problems. And right now, one of the deepest, most intractable problems is the polarization and extremism baked into our political system and the terrible incentives. And the biggest corrective measure for that is ranked choice voting. And one of the struggles you'll see, Governor Lamont has endorsed ranked choice voting, and I believe that the legislature will pass it. But around the country, it's difficult to get Democrats or Republicans on board with ranked choice voting because it loosens their control. They should be on board. It results in better officials, better incentives, more collegiality, less negative campaigning. There's no more spoiler effects. You can vote for whomever you want. There's no more accusation of like, oh, you're going to mess it up. You're going to waste your vote. So people should be on board. In a place like Alaska, it kept Sarah Palin from winning her race. It allowed Lisa Murkowski to vote to impeach Donald Trump and still make it back through the primary. So anyone who wants moderate and reasonable leadership should be for ranked choice voting, but the traditional parties have a hard time endorsing it because it loosens their control. And when you talk about the innovative ideas behind candidates who are going to be part of the Forward Party, I hope you're right. But the core idea has to be that our system itself must evolve if we're going to make it through this time.
So what's a good night for you on November 8th? I mean, obviously you're coming into this, without a huge, long runway to get there. But at the end of the night, what will make it a good or maybe not so good night for the Forward Party?
Our sights are very keenly set on this Senate race in Utah, in large part because Evan McMullin is running as an independent. There is no Democrat in that race, and his opponent is the Trump-endorsed incumbent, Mike Lee, in a state Trump won by 21 points. If Evan can defeat Mike Lee, it shows that a new independent brand of politics can restore a degree of dynamism and genuine competition in parts of the country that people would have thought essentially off limits. And I want to praise the Democratic Party of Utah for deciding not to run a candidate. Nonpartisan primaries and ranked choice voting are on a statewide ballot initiative in Nevada. And if that passes, then Nevada is going to follow Alaska in getting rid of party primaries and letting people vote for whomever they want. So those are two of the highest stakes races for the Forward Party. And anyone who wants to help those succeed, go to forwardparty.com or go to evanmcmullin.com and let's help the people in Nevada have a real set of choices in the future. Let's show that an independent like Evan McMullin can win a U.S. Senate seat. And by the way, if he wins that seat, think about the impact that could have on our national politics, because in a polarized country, you only need one U.S. senator to influence everything.
So, Andrew Yang, as you look 2 years out from here, I mean, in presidential races, third-party candidates have a different kind of standing or status, typically. Typically, they don't get any electoral votes, but they might, spoil somebody else's chances. You think about Perot in 92. I think he got about 19% of the vote, but I don't think he won any electoral votes. Nader in 2000, we know what happened there. And so there's that scenario. Then there's the other scenario where a third-party candidate does get electoral votes. There's a risk you could throw an election into the House of Representatives, which I don't think anybody wants to see. So how do you think about presidential politics and a party like the one that you're co-chairing right now?
We're focused on the 500,000 local races, 70% of which are uncontested or uncompetitive. There's a lot of good we can do at every level. And it's unfortunate that as a country, we're always so fixated on the presidential. I get it. I ran for president. So people think that that's what we're thinking about all the time, but we're genuinely not. I will say that 58% of Americans are not excited about a Biden-Trump rematch. Their combined age will be 159 in 2024. And it's just a sign of how decrepit and breaking down before our eyes the two-party system is if that's the choice.
So how do you see your own future as a politician? And I guess what I'm really asking you is, would you ever go back to the Democratic Party? Do you think you're probably going to be a Forward Party person or some version of that for the rest of your own career in public life?
Well, I love the fact that this episode is about new parties or third parties. And you have to look up and say, is this American political system getting better or worse? Is it going to get more polarized, or is it going to snap back to its senses? And unfortunately, most people think that the worst case is more on the table. That's where I am. And that's why the Forward Party is so important. You ask about my personal role. I'm not someone who grew up with a ton of ambition for elected office. I'm the son of immigrants, and my parents were not like, you're going to, run for office someday. Like that wasn't the narrative. For me, I'm just trying to make this country stronger and better for my kids, for your kids. And right now, I think structural reform matters more than having a good person. I prefer good people in office to not good people. I really do. But we have deeper problems than that. We have to fix the underlying incentives and the root causes of this dysfunction. And that's what I'm after now. That's what motivates the Forward Party.
There have to be Democrats who come to you and say, yeah, Andrew, but really, there's one party that has increasingly become essentially an unserious party. And if that party wins the midterm elections and Kevin McCarthy becomes Speaker of the House, and you're going to see, people like Boebert and Gosar and people like that, they're going to have leadership assignments or big committee jobs. And these people are barely recognizable as conventional politicians, and not in a good way. You can't really make the same case, Andrew, in my hypothetical Democratic person who's still talking to you. You can't really make the same case, Andrew, about our party. So why disadvantage our party? Why not simply, continue to be a certain kind of force within the Democratic Party? We need you there more than we need you in the Forward Party.
Again, if you think about the landscape and the road ahead, in a two-party system, it's a bad plan to say, you know what our plan is? We're going to defeat the other party from now until the end of time. I mean, the fact is that's a dumb plan. Now, are we, in point of fact, at the Forward Party endorsing Lauren Boebert's opponent in Colorado? Yes, we are. But the bigger task ahead is to make it so that we're going to get through not just the next 2 weeks or 2 years, but the next 20 years with a democracy that's still functioning and is modern and is resilient and is not susceptible to authoritarianism and demagoguery. So Democrats who think that, look, we're going to hold power forever against the Republican Party are probably going to be disappointed. The more fundamental, important task is to make it so that we can actually survive terrible leadership in one party or another without the entire thing descending into authoritarianism. That's the challenge we're faced with, and we have to get with it. It's like the defeat the other party for all time strategy just will not work in a two-party system in a country where something like 85% of Americans think we're on the wrong track.
All right. That was a great answer. So we should probably stop there. Andrew Yang, a co-founder and co-chair of the New Forward Party. He previously ran as a Democratic candidate for president and for mayor of New York City. Thanks for your time.
Thank you. Check us out at forwardparty.com. And Connecticut's a real hotbed for us. Thank you to everyone who made the Greeble Frank for Connecticut Party happen. Appreciate the heck out of you, and we're just going to grow from here.
Thank you.
Forward. Best foot first, just in case. When we made our way till now, it's time to listen.
I tell you, my people, vote for me, and I promise you, by next week, you'll all be rich.
All right, so we're still talking about third parties or minor parties or whatever you want to call them. We are going to transition from Andrew Yang now to Seth Masket, professor of political science and the director of the Center on American Politics at the University of Denver. He's the author of The Inevitable Party, Why Attempts to Kill the Party System Fail and How They Weaken Democracy, among other books. Seth Masket, welcome to our show.
Thank you for having me on today.
So the founders of this nation didn't necessarily think a lot about political parties, or at least they didn't necessarily price them into the system. Were they unintentionally developing a system that would be heavily reliant on just two parties?
In some ways, yes. A lot of the institutions that they built into the country tended to favor a two-party system, whether you're talking about the Electoral College, the way they seem to want congressional representation to work. That is where, everyone was represented by a single member of Congress. You were in a district where you had winner-take-all elections. That is where, no matter whoever gets the most votes, no matter how many votes it is, they win the entire district. That's a pattern that's pretty consistent with two-party government in a lot of countries around the world. And so, that architecture that they built tended to lead to that sort of thing.
Yes. And so for extra political science credit, there actually is something called Duverger's law. Explain what that is. It says basically what you just said, but say it again.
Yeah, basically, it just means that in election systems like we have in the U.S., where you have elections where it's everyone represents a district, whoever wins, the plurality of the vote in that district wins the entire district. That tends to boil things down to just two parties, and this is because voters tend to look at their options and they see really only two realistic candidates of winning. And a vote for a third candidate is seen as a wasted vote. That is, it either won't count or it will actually make it a little easier for the candidate you least like to win. So voters are pretty strategic about it, and they tend to just vote for one of the two major options. And that's, this isn't an ironclad law around the world, but for the most part, democracies that have those systems tend to have two major parties.
Right. It's not ironclad even in the sense of, Great Britain basically for many years has effectively had three parties, right?
Yeah, Great Britain, it's an interesting case where they do have representation like this. They usually have it's a roughly two-party system, yeah. But yes, for once in a while they have had a strong liberal party. They've sometimes had some strong regional parties. So it's not a perfect example.
But a good example of the kind of thinking behind Duverger's law, I would assume, would be 2000. So you've got Bush versus Gore. It's going to be a close election. Ralph Nader is running as a Green Party candidate. And obviously Florida came down to this incredibly tight recount. And so at that point, every vote that Ralph Nader got was essentially a potential problem if you were a Gore supporter.
Yeah, and that was actually something people were very conscious of at the time. And there were people in Florida and in other very close states, urging Nader supporters not to vote for Ralph Nader, but to support one of the two major party candidates. And this was particularly coming from Gore supporters, saying that we recognize Al Gore isn't everything that you want, but if you do this, you could end up throwing the election to George W. Bush. Which is, of course, basically what happened. And Nader didn't need to do particularly well there. He didn't get that many votes in Florida, but it was a close enough election that made all the difference, both in that state and for the nation as a whole.
Yeah, and we'll get to the whole question of his influence on policy in a few seconds. But if you look at 92, you've got Perot running, and he pulls a pretty substantial portion of the vote, creates a situation different from what Ralph did in the sense that you've got in that situation you are going to have a plurality victor. I can't remember what Bill Clinton got in 92, but I think it was around 46% or something like that. You're going to have somebody winning the presidency with a lower vote total. And you're also, most Republicans would say that the reason Bush 41 lost was because of Perot.
Yeah, there's actually been a few political science studies of this suggesting Perot probably took evenly from both Clinton and Bush. And that if Perot hadn't entered the race, that Clinton probably still wins it. Obviously, we don't get to run this over again and find out. But he probably draws evenly. But he did, for a third-party candidate or a nonpartisan candidate, whatever you want to call him, he did unusually well, getting like 19% of the votes. So essentially like 1 out of 5 votes cast that year, even though he didn't win any state.
So in a way, we tend to hyper-focus on, and Andrew Yang was saying this in the previous segment too, hyper-focus on presidential races, on national races. But the history of the United States also includes an awful lot of third-party activity at the state and at the local level. Here in Connecticut, we've had it a few times, probably most notably Lowell Weicker creating something called a Connecticut Party that at least survived his governorship a little bit. You started to have some candidates for the state legislature who were running as a Connecticut Party, and I think a few of them even winning. And that it tended to be a certain kind of person. It tended to be sort of a quirky Republican, not unlike Lowell Weicker. It tended to be a person who, was a Republican but didn't quite tick all the boxes of conservatism. And that struck me as essentially a pretty healthy situation.
Yeah, we've had situations like that, and right, it is important to look like below the presidential level. We've seen that in other states as well at different points in history. In the early 20th century, there was a very strong progressive movement in a lot of Western states. In some places, the progressives were kind of like the more liberal branch of the Republican Party. And in other places, they really were their own separate party. In California, there was a progressive governor, and there were progressive leaders in a lot of Midwestern states at that time. You can see that in a few places, and they don't always last very long. Usually, just a few election cycles. The Populist Party, even in the late 1800s, formed as sort of a third party, but was kind of subsumed by the Democratic Party at the time. Eventually, one of the parties is usually pretty good at kind of co-opting them, getting them back in the fold, maybe moving a little bit in that minor party's direction in order to win many of their supporters over.
Would it be fair to say that in America, the kind of history of this has been for third parties, either you're going to supplant one of the two existing major parties, or you're going to wither and die, or, as you say, get absorbed into the blob of one of the two major parties?
Yeah, I think so. Though mostly, like the last time we had a third party that really supplanted one of the major parties, I mean, we're talking about the Republican Party in the 1850s, which basically took advantage of the fact that the Whigs had become very divided between their northern and southern wings, and the Republicans just kind of rose up as the first anti-slavery party, and just became a major party within a few short years. We haven't really seen that happen since then. So for the most part, it's been, when a third party movement does arise, it may do well at the local level for a couple of cycles, but usually its supporters get won over by one party or the other.
So one of the advantages that an existing party has, one of the two major parties will be some kind of infrastructure, some kind of leadership structure, some kind of fundraising mechanisms. Although I'd be interested to hear what you think about this. I feel like in my lifetime, I've watched that wear down a little bit, and to a certain degree, it seems more and more like political candidates, both at the state and national level, are kind of individual chieftains answerable to nobody. I mean, I'm old enough to remember, a guy named John Bailey who came out of Connecticut but wound up being the chairman of the Democratic Party nationally, who really he was in the manner of those old-style political bosses. He could individually make decisions that would affect candidacies and all kinds of stuff. I feel like there's been a decentralization within the two existing major parties. So do they still confer the same advantage under those circumstances?
It's interesting to look at that. And this is an area I've been studying for a while now, that, when people within a party, if you think of parties as sort of broader, coalitions or networks, not just of like the Democratic National Committee or the Republican National Committee or something like that, but also like networks of like major donors and office holders and interest group leaders, labor unions, and so forth. When they back a candidate pretty early on, before the primaries, that candidate tends to do pretty well. They in some ways, though, that group of party insiders can really steer the party and pick its nominees. But we have seen that fray a little bit. Like in 2008, if you looked at the patterns of Democrats going into that presidential nomination, like the bulk of them seemed to be backing Hillary Clinton. Like they were a little wary about Barack Obama. They weren't sure he could win anything until he dominated the Iowa caucuses. And then, a bunch of them like moved toward him. And then, of course, you get to 2016, and the Republican Party had a complete breakdown there, where like almost none of the party leadership wanted Donald Trump to be their nominee. But then he just kind of, he was able to dominate the primaries and caucuses, and then the party leadership just rallied behind him. So there's still, I think, a lot of power that a party's central leaders can have, but it's not 100%, and they have been kind of vulnerable to, strong, wealthy, well-organized candidates who can come in and kind of take over.
Yeah, and if you look at the other side of 2016, Bernie Sanders is kind of the Ralph Nader of that moment, except that he decides that he's going to do it within his existing party. He's going to be, well, to the extent that he is a Democrat, he's going to do this within the Democratic Party. I assume simply because he believes, back to Duverger's law, that there's no other way to get to be president.
Yes, and this is, an interesting thing that both Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump have in common is that they both have like their own following, they both have sort of a reputation that's independent of political parties, but they also both calculated that the way to actually become president is through a party. That if you go it alone, there's no way to pull that off. That didn't work for Bernie Sanders. But I think he certainly did far better as a major Democratic candidate than he would have, running as a third party candidate, in which case he might have just been a spoiler, getting like 3-4% of the vote.
So we're at a, kind of a nadir of political expectations and political confidence in this country. 71% of the people think the country's going in the wrong direction. You would think this really would be kind of an interesting time for a third party. There's a loss of confidence, I think, in both of the two major parties. So I don't know. We've got the Forward Party. I know some of your thoughts about that, but you should probably share a couple of them now.
So on the Forward Party, I think some of the critiques of the current two-party system are certainly correct in there. But I think the major thing harming the Forward Party is that it doesn't really have much of a platform. That is, it's hard to pinpoint anything that it wants to do when in office. When pressed, they'll usually say, well, we simply want to take the most popular views and push them forward, and it's not left or right. And I don't really know how that attracts anyone to it. One of the things that minor parties have been successful in is, bringing attention to a set of issues that the major parties are ignoring, whether that's something like slavery or whether that's the environmental movement or something like that, and just sort of forcing the other parties to move to that. The Forward Party isn't really pushing anything like that. It's just saying, if you don't like the other parties, join us. And I'm not sure there's much incentive for people to do that. One of the things I think we saw quickly on this, in 2016, we also had a lot of people dissatisfied with the direction of the country. We also had like two of probably the least popular major party presidential nominees in history, in Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. A lot of people didn't like either of them. In theory, that was a really ripe situation to have a third party candidacy, and none of them really took off. Like, the third party candidates didn't do better than like 5% of the vote. So if it didn't happen then, I'm not really sure why it would happen now.
Right. Well, back to the Forward Party, and I take your point, and we should say, they're the only policies that they have kind of etched in stone are the ones that make it easier for third-party candidates to function in the system. They're all kind of election-related beyond that. But I also feel as though policy sets in general. I have a friend named Bill Curry who ran for governor here in Connecticut twice, and then he was part of the Clinton White House. And Bill is like the only person I know who actually reads party platforms or even knows where to go to read party platforms. And every electoral season, he walks around trying to have a conversation with somebody about the party platforms, and nobody else has read them. And I feel increasingly as though there's no such thing as Trumpism. He's not running on policies. He's running on some other kind of inchoate appeal as a disruptor or something. And I'm not sure the Democratic Party really clearly articulates a policy set anymore. This is something we keep coming back to, this idea that maybe people are voting on identity more than on policy these days.
We certainly do see that. I think, the parties are probably more polarized now than they've ever been in American history, and including, polarized on policy. That may not be what the major candidates are talking about all the time, but if you actually do look at the platforms, or if you look for what the parties push when they're in power, there's some pretty stark differences on things like abortion laws and on guns and on tax policy and on environmental regulations. Like, the parties are, if you put one party in power, you're going to get very different results from when the other party was in power. But that's not necessarily what a lot of voters are thinking of. A lot of times they're thinking more about the identity of the parties, what that identity means in terms of race, in terms of gender, in terms of sexual orientation, a whole bunch of other different things. It's just, people just respond. A lot of Democrats respond very, viscerally to the idea of, they're bothered when someone is a Republican, and Republicans feel pretty bothered by Democrats. And that sort of, that kind of tribal instinct to work against the other team is pretty strong, and it's reinforced by a lot of other identities that we have in our lives.
Right. It seems like an awful lot of people are playing goalie. They're trying to prevent something from happening, something that the other party would cause, as opposed to what their own party would actually do. So, in the time we have left, we should just talk about other options. There are ways in which, if we wanted a more flourishing, biome of different parties, we could do it, right? We could make structural changes, including stuff like even to get around the gerrymandering that exists now. You could have systems where, the name of the system and I don't, but whatever your allotment of congressional delegates are, let's say you get 8, you get 8 from your state, and they're not tied necessarily to congressional districts. There's just the top 8 vote getters. Maybe talk about that and other things that would loosen the logjam for third parties a little bit.
Yeah, there are a number of reforms that are, actually a few cities and states are experimenting with right now that, if they were adopted more widely, we could see like more parties, and that includes things like ranked choice voting, which we saw like in the New York City mayor's race, and a few other places, multi-member districts, like you were mentioning, where, and a few state legislatures have had these, but this would mean something like you said, I'm in Colorado. We have 8 congressional districts, and it could simply be everyone in the state votes for 8 slots and however many candidates, and you just sort of rank your choices. If you have those kind of election systems, that can move us more to what is usually called proportional representation, which is common in a lot of European democracies. Under proportional representation, the idea is if you vote for, if a party gets like roughly 30% of the vote, they will get roughly 30% of the seats in Congress or in the state legislature. So at that point, it actually kind of makes sense to vote for a minor party if it's what you believe in, if they're closest to you in terms of what you care about. And under those kind of systems, you might see a third, fourth, or fifth party become fairly prominent. And the advantage of a situation like that, where you have more parties, is that the costs of polarization are not quite so great. People are not so terrified about one party gaining power as compared to another. And you end up with a somewhat less polarized system. You end up with a system that's much more dependent on negotiation. It doesn't necessarily mean it's a more stable system. I mean, we've certainly seen in some other countries that they have frequent elections, coalitions can fall apart and have to reform. But they can be a little more stable in the long run in terms of just diminishing some of the hyper polarization we're seeing in some of the costlier aspects of our system.
So I should have asked you about this sooner, and this will be the last thing we get into. But a lot of times third-party candidates don't win, but they do have an impact on policy. I mean, Perot's a great example. He was talking about the deficit, the crazy old aunt in the attic, and ultimately that became one of the linchpins of Bill Clinton's approach as president in his first term. So it isn't as though you don't do anything. I mean, usually third-party presidential candidates don't get any electoral votes because of the winner-take-all system, but they do leave some kind of legacy.
Yeah, and I think Perot is a great example of that because you saw both Democrats and Republicans coming out of that, seeing him as kind of a centrist candidate. That is, he was drawing from both parties, and his big issue was the deficit. And so this is part of what led, both parties in the 1990s to focus on deficit reduction. It's part of what led to actually, us running a number of budget surpluses in the late 1990s, simply because both Bill Clinton and the congressional leadership saw debt reduction as an important issue that would actually win them some votes. And so they were fighting over that. You could also see it sort of with that, I mentioned earlier, the Progressive Party of the early 20th century. They were able to kind of drive both the Republicans and the Democrats toward supporting things like an income tax, toward some workplace safety laws, toward getting children out of mines and factories and things like that. They were able to make a difference, even though they didn't dominate politics nationally, and we never really had presidents of those parties. So third parties, even if they don't win, they can certainly drive things, and they can make a real difference.
We're going to have to stop there. This is fascinating stuff, though. Seth Masket, professor of political science and the director of the Center on American Politics at the University of Denver, the author of The Inevitable Party: Why Attempts to Kill the Party System Fail and How They Weaken Democracy.
It must be nice. It must be nice. Follow the money and see where it goes. It must be nice. It must be nice. The emperor has no clothes. We won't be invisible. We won't be denied. Still, it must be nice. It must be nice to have Washington on your side.
All right, special thanks to Dylan Reyes. He's our technical producer today. And Lily Tyson, who's the senior producer of the Colin McEnroe Show, is the producer of this episode. Now joining us is Dr. Amy Chai, an independent party candidate for Connecticut's 3rd U.S. Congressional District. We want to find out a little bit about what it's like to be out there under these circumstances. So first of all, Amy Chai, welcome to our show.
Thank you, Colin. It's great to be here.
So explain why you did what you did. With your views, you probably could have campaigned, it's pretty hard to unseat Rosa DeLauro in a primary, but explain why you decided to go the independent party route.
Well, I have never been a member of a major party in my life. I have been fully disenfranchised for my entire life, just like 50% of the American population that doesn't see any candidate that really represents their views. I've never been able to vote in a primary because I'm not affiliated with a party, and I've never voted for a candidate. I've always voted for the lesser of two evils. So it's on principle that I chose to run as an independent, and because I believe that I want to represent people like me, people without a political home, people who feel that their voices aren't being heard, and people that feel like they're just being suppressed by giving two options that, frankly, we can't even imagine how these people could be on the ballot. We
should say, and I mentioned this earlier in the show, the Independent Party, which is actually the 3rd largest party, and I think by a lot, in Connecticut, it's so easily confused with being an independent candidate, small I. In order to get this particular nomination, similar to the Forward Party, there isn't really any kind of policy litmus test for the Independent Party, right?
Correct. The Independent Party is really just a ballot access party because the ballot access is so onerous here in Connecticut. It's literally nobody that tried to get ballot access through getting all the signatures was allowed on by the Secretary of State this year. And even though they provided all the signatures, they were all disallowed by the Secretary of State. So getting that treasured ballot access is very difficult, especially when you're being attacked on both sides. As you probably are aware, Bob Stefanowski created a lawsuit to try to wipe the independent candidates off our own ballot. And Ned was a little bit more subtle. He got the Green Party candidate, Michelle Bicking, off of the Grable-Frank line by lying about ranked choice voting, which his Secretary of State recently said in her debate that Connecticut isn't ready for ranked choice voting. So he just wanted to grab those extra points or two that he was going to get from the Grable-Frank line. And, Bob wanted the couple points he was going to get from the independent line. But as for me, I'm neither right nor left. I'm a full-on pragmatist. I believe in solving problems. And, why don't they solve problems, really? Because there's actually no incentive to solve problems. In fact, solving problems eliminates the conflict and the fear and the hatred that drives partisan voting and drives money. So solving problems is just not what they're into in the two-party system.
So, we talked before, I was talking to Seth Masket about the kind of party infrastructure.
Right.
The independent party doesn't really have the kind of party infrastructure that can help you. So I'm watching.
Correct. It has no structure at all.
I'm watching online commercials, which I think you're making in your basement against a wall you painted green or something. And
you're so right.
Adorably, I can hear you go 3, 2, 1 before you start talking. So I mean, talk a little bit about that. It is hard, right? I mean, you don't have a lot of lunch money.
I don't. I am a physician. I've served the underserved my whole life. I don't have any rich friends. People give me $25 here and there. People have said, why should we take you seriously? Because you don't have any big donors. And I thought, well, that's actually a feature, not a bug. I will not and will never take big money donors because I refuse to be purchased, because I want to serve people, not a party, not a major donor. I'm here to solve problems, and people don't really get that. So at every turn, I have been pushed back and my voice has been suppressed. I was kept out of the debates. Rosa DeLauro refused to debate me, and Leslie DeNardis also refused to debate me. And it's been very challenging. And press releases are 9 out of 10 outlets in Connecticut are owned by Hearst Media. And Hearst Media won't go to any of my press releases or publish, any of my op-eds because they're so in the tank for Rosa. And, we have all the places where Rosa goes for her electioneering. When I call for equal access, I'm not allowed in. So for me to get any attention at all, I have to do like crazy, wacky things like hiring an airplane to fly around the city of New Haven. And it said, retire Rosa, 32 years and kids still can't read, vote Chai. So it was just flying around. It was a little crazy. And people are thinking like, who is this crazy person? Well, I'm just trying to get my message out there against insurmountable odds, against a candidate who has millions of dollars, hasn't spent a dime of her own money, has 90 full-time staff. And for me, it's just me and a green wall.
Oh, yeah. I do want to say, as a columnist for Hearst Media, I'm not in the tank for Rosa or for anybody, but I don't go to the staff meetings.
Good.
Maybe they make announcements at them. So, I mean, we got a minute left. We have less than a minute left. So this is going to be like in 24 words. What do you want to see come out of this? Imagine hypothetically that you don't beat Rosa DeLauro on November 8th. What good legacy will come out of the candidacy from your point of view?
I've already got a coalition in New Haven City, and I'm going to solve the reading and mental health crisis so that I don't have more addicted, dead people coming, or I just can't handle what's happening to the children in New Haven because I'm an addiction specialist. The school to prison pipeline must end, and I'll end it no matter what, whether I'm elected or not. And I already have a coalition.
All right. Amy Chai, we're going to have to get out right now. Amy Chai is a candidate in the 3rd District from the Independent Party. Thanks for listening today.